on. My guest right now is John Malcolm from the Heritage Foundation. He's a legal analyst, and I wanted to scheduled this yesterday, John, obviously before everything that happened in Washington and Virginia, but I wanted to touch on the Sessions testimony. Overall, he seemed to have gotten fairly good marks from at least from the right side of the spectrum on how he handled himself during this hearing. What was your take on it?
Yeah, look, I thought that General Sessions did a superb job. He obviously took this incredibly personally. He was supposed to testify yesterday before a House Appropriations Committee about budgetary matters for the Department of Justice, and he said, nope, I won't go to that hearing. I'll send Rod Rosenstein, my deputy, to that hearing. I'll testify in front of the Senate Intelligence Committee, and no, we will not do this behind closed doors. I want everybody to hear what I had to say. And he was emotional. He obviously cares tremendously, as he should, about his reputation. And he had obviously heard a number of things from Jim Comey last week that disturbed him deeply, and he wanted to get his side of the story out, and he did so forcefully.
Yeah.
And he said that he never had any conversation with any Russians pertaining to the election or any interference with the election. He has no knowledge of anybody having such conversations within the Trump campaign, and any suggestion that he would be part of any collusion with the Russians to in any way hurt our government was, to quote him, an appalling and detestable lie. He made it clear why he had recused himself. It had nothing to do with any suggestion that he might have done anything wrong. It was only because he had been a campaign spokesman, and it was the campaign that was going to be scrutinized here, so he cited to a justice regulation that basically mandated that he recuse himself in such situations, and he made it very clear that he had not lied before Congress with respect to any contacts with Ambassador Kislyak, the Russian ambassador to the United States, and when he had a particularly testy exchange with Democrat Oregon Senator Ron Wyden. Ron Wyden said at one point, he said, the question is, Mr. Comey said there were questions with respect to your recusal that were problematic, and he couldn't talk about them. What are they? You could see Sessions bristle. And he said, why don't you tell me? There are none, Senator Wyden. I can tell you that for absolute certainty. This is a secret innuendo being leaked out there about me, and I don't appreciate it. I thought he was just as forceful and persuasive as I've ever heard Senator Sessions before.
He's got it. He had to. You sense the frustration. When Comey testified last week, he suggested that he was a little frustrated with some of the leaks, even though we ended up finding out he was a leaker himself, but frustrated with some of the leaks because he had not been able to come out and address them. If the New York Times posts something that's not true, he said, we're not going to call up the New York Times and say that's not true because we're not going to comment one way or the other. You got the impression that Sessions has kind of been holding all of this inside for the past couple of months, and he was just ready to go. He didn't want to do it in private because he wanted to choose some of his former colleagues out for the innuendo.
Right. I think that's exactly right. And he essentially turned to them and said, I've been a public servant for 35 years. You've known me for decades. And, the suggestion that I would do anything to undermine the integrity of our election or to do anything else with the Russians or any other country to harm the interests of the United States was shocking. And even though he was, in my opinion, shabbily treated during his own confirmation hearing, even taking that into account, to suggest that he was in collusion with the Russians to undermine the integrity of our election was a bridge too far for Senator Sessions. And yes, you got the impression as if he had been keeping this bottled in for so long and listening to Comey saying, I think that General Sessions, he was reluctant to leave me alone, and with Trump in the White House, and he didn't really help me very much when I came to him and said that protocols weren't being followed, and there are reasons why he was being accused. I can't talk about him. I'll have to tell you behind closed doors. It was just too much for Senator Sessions to take anymore, and I can't blame him.
No, you can't. Well, I was glad. I thought that he comported himself very well, and there seemed to be some frustration that he wouldn't open up more about conversations with the president, but on legal grounds, he was doing the correct thing. Is that right?
Yeah, boy, I was amazed that came up. Kamala Harris, senator from California, was eating into him about this, as were others. I mean, there is such a thing as executive privilege. I mean, that's been established since the Nixon Watergate tapes, is that presidents are entitled to have full and frank and candid discussions with people within the executive branch, and that privilege is recognized precisely so that they can exercise candor and not worry about their words coming back to bite them. So anytime a president has a personal conversation with any executive branch official, but particularly a cabinet official, the president can assert executive privilege. He may choose to do so or not, but it is certainly, he has to have that option. And all General Sessions was saying was, look, I have personal conversations with the president. I'm not going to talk about those. There is a privilege that attaches to this. And they kept saying, well, where is this written? Where's this policy? It's like, this is Supreme Court case law. This is the law of the land. There is nobody who disputes the existence of an executive privilege. It can be waived, but that privilege exists. And all he was saying is, I am not going to waive that privilege for the president. That's the president's prerogative to assert that privilege or to waive that privilege. And it was an absolutely proper answer to give. And I was, frankly, surprised that people were really giving him a hard time about that. That is a privilege that has been honored by both parties when a president is in office and speaking with subordinates.
Yeah, well said. John Malcolm with the Heritage Foundation. I appreciate your time today and giving us a rundown on your take of how Jeff Sessions did yesterday. Thank you, sir.
Great to be with you.
All right, take care of yourself. Appreciate that. Glad to get John on there. He oversees the Edwin Meese Center for Legal and Judicial Studies at Heritage, and he is on top of this stuff. So I was glad to get his thoughts on that. By the way, I mentioned this earlier. This